MyFlora Fridays. Ruth Fisher, it's so nice to meet you. We've been following each other on LinkedIn for quite a while, and I find you incredibly impressive and interesting. I didn't know a lot about you until I did some snooping around your website and stuff. But you know you better than I know you, obviously. So why don't you go ahead and tell everybody who you are, what you do, and why you're in the cannabis space?
Thank you for inviting me. As you said, we've been commenting on each other's posts for quite some time, and I really admire you. And I was so delighted and flattered that you invited me. So thank you.
Mhm.
And I'm really excited to have this discussion. As I kind of briefly mentioned, I'm kind of an oddball in the industry and in general. I came to cannabis because I have a deep background in healthcare and research. And my brother started using cannabis for his MS pain. And the reason he started is he had tried everything else to try and address his pain. And one of his doctors at one point, a neurologist, said, I think you might be able to benefit from cannabis, but I can't give you any guidance. And, of course, we all know that how distressing that is and difficult, but that's the reality of cannabis. So he started playing around and using it, and I didn't know anything about this. And at some point, he came to me and he said, I'm using cannabis for my pain. And I'm like, really? And he said, yeah, and I'm actually getting some benefits, some effects. And I was just floored by that. But he said, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I think if I knew what I was doing better, I'd be getting better effects. Can you help me figure this out? Now, I will say that my brother by that time had been on a very long and difficult journey. And it was very difficult for me to watch him go through this and not be able to do anything. And at the same time, I will say that while I had experience with cannabis, yeah, I'd been high before, I knew nothing about it. And I completely bought into the stigma and kind of was colored by the stigma. And when he came to me, that's why I was surprised when he said, cannabis is working. And to me, cannabis isn't medicine. And I'd been working on a case about 15 years prior to that involving AIDS drugs. And at that time, I was researching the market for AIDS drugs, and the issue of medical cannabis came up. So I was aware of it. And I remember just utterly, completely dismissing cannabis as being a medicinal product at the time. I figured that, if people wanted to smoke and get high, then fine. But as far as it being medical, yeah, there's no way in hell that was the case. So now fast forward ahead 15 years, my brother comes to me, and this is finally something I can do to help him.
Mm.
And so I said to myself, I said, okay, I don't care what baggage you're bringing about cannabis to the table. I finally can do something. I'm going to just figure this out. And so I just started reading, and, it's very, cannabis is such an utterly complex place. It's kind of its beauty and its downfall. I started reading, and when I finally started understanding what's going on, it actually took me a while. And I will say, I'm an experienced researcher, I'm an economist, and what I do is market dynamics, a lot of market research. I'm very interested in technology, science and technology. So I've done research on so many different science and technology markets. And when I started researching cannabis, it took me a long time to even begin to start to understand what was going on. I have never seen any other market that's as complicated as cannabis, and in so many dimensions. I mean, you have the medical issues, you have the legal issues, you have the regulatory issues, you have the cultural issues, you have medical versus recreational, you have big companies versus small companies. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, all the complexities. But so, of course, at some point I learned about the endocannabinoid system. And for me, that was a game changer. And I remember that moment. It was so foundational for me because in anyone who's come to cannabis who had been colored by the stigma and starts to understand it, gets that realization, holy shit, they've been lying to me all this time. And once I realized that, and I started reading about the potential of the plant, all I wanted to do was to try and convince other people who had been like me and are still colored by the stigma that no, this is legitimate medicine. And so I started doing a lot of research in the medical aspect and thinking about how traditional people from the consumer and patient community and from the medical community, I've spent a lot of time in healthcare with the traditional medical community. How are they all thinking about it? What are they thinking about? And how do I try and best communicate with them in their language or how they're thinking about it to help them better understand cannabis? And I've done a
Mhm.
lot of work in writing and speaking in that area. At the same time, as an economist, I'm very interested in market research, market dynamics, market evolution. Kind of, I've been fascinated to watch how this brand new industry that kind of sprung up from scratch and has had to build itself from scratch with no help from anyone else. How does that happen? And as an economist who's interested in market dynamics, that's just, it's like being a kid in a candy shop. But so
Mhm.
I've come at it. And then, as I kind of mentioned, the third area that I'm very interested in, aside from healthcare, is technology, science and technology. And so looking at cannabis through this kind of market dynamic, the medical aspect, and the science and technology, I'm interested in all those areas. And I've done kind of a lot of scattershot research and analysis and thinking about those different areas.
I wish that I could look into your brain like a TV. Like I can't even imagine like because clearly you think differently than I do and I think you see patterns. I am the kind of person that very rarely connects one thing with another thing. Like I have a headache or I get headaches, like I won't be able to figure out what triggers them. It doesn't even like in my brain. I'm not like, oh, these must be triggered by chocolate because I get a headache every time I eat chocolate. That doesn't even occur to me. I'm really bad at connecting this thing and that thing, are connected somehow. I'm very bad at that. So I'd love to look into your brain. I think it would be really interesting. And as you were talking right there, I was thinking, yeah, like cannabis is so interesting in so many different ways, and having it be simultaneously both a brand new industry, starting, pretty much 2015 is when people were actually 2012, 2015, whatever, people were actually able to get their hands on it legally, having it be both like a brand new billion-dollar industry and also an incredibly old utilized plant, one of the first cultivated plants that we know about from human history. Like that must be crazy for you, like to think about. So you've sort of built this personal and professional bridge in cannabis, right? So you've got your brother's story, and you also did some work with AIDS patients, and you thought that they were just using cannabis to sort of, I don't know, dull
Yeah.
the pain and the agony that comes with, having this terminal illness. So why not have some fun at the end, sort of thing, which is really interesting. Come to find out that, it is real medicine. And that's just an amazing story. Like I think a lot of people think like that. And I mean, I don't even know what to ask you next. Like, I know you've written a couple of papers very recently. Like, what is a cannabis user? I have not read it, full disclosure, but can you talk about that? That's your most recent one, right? And then yeah. Can you talk
That
about
one. So I was very well trained how to evaluate studies. And I go through and I read a lot of studies. And it's discipline. I mean, most research is problematic in one way or another. And sometimes I feel like a hypocrite, like, well, it's easy to go and criticize other people's stuff. Am I actually doing my own? Why I don't do any like original research. I'm not a clinician going out testing different things. And it's very easy for me to sit here and criticize. On the other hand, the reason I'm reading the research is I'm trying to understand things. What do we know? And how do we do things right or well? And it's disappointing. I've read hundreds or thousands of studies at this point on cannabis, and so many of them, I would say most of them, are so methodologically flawed as to be completely unusable.
hmm
And so I was reading a bunch of studies trying, I'll find an issue and then start reading about it. And when there's a lot of studies out there that are trying, so a couple of things that I look at is, okay, so does cannabis cause lung cancer?
Hmm.
So this is one of the earlier areas I was very interested in. People smoke it. And, I was a former smoker. And so I know very well that, all the literature out there being bombarded for a long time on how smoking causes lung cancer. And you just obviously can't escape that. And so coming to cannabis and the medical community just dismissing smoking outright is just something that you would never do, because patients are trying to get well, you would never prescribe smoking to someone because you're harming them. And so
Hmm.
this issue of smoking cannabis is so fundamental to the whole experience. And I was reading studies out there, and it's very interesting. And so the studies were all concluding that cannabis causes lung cancer.
Hmm.
And, I always go and I look at the methodology. Well, who are the people that are in the study and what do we know about them? And are they randomly selected and blah, blah, blah. And it was very quickly became apparent to me that when you look at all those studies, well, what causes lung cancer? We all know smoking tobacco causes lung cancer. Well, so they need to control for that,
Hmm.
meaning they need to understand if the people in the studies are smokers, they need to understand that that's now being conflated with their cannabis. And it turns out, if you look at all these studies and they go back many years historically, almost all cannabis smokers were also tobacco smokers. So
Hmm.
when they're using these people in the studies and they're concluding that cannabis causes smoking, they're not separating out that factor that no, these are actually tobacco users too, that's messing up the results.
Hmm.
It's only been very, very recently that they finally recognize this. And now they're separating out never smokers, never tobacco smokers. They smoke cannabis, but never tobacco, and studying them. And they're finding, lo and behold, they cannot connect them to lung cancer. They have emphysema and COPD, but not cancer.
Okay.
And so when you look at all this historical research and, I trying to understand cannabis, this is another thing about cannabis. It was so interesting to me is when I came to it and I'm doing all this reading and I'm trying to understand how it works. For every study I found that says cannabis helps with pain or cannabis helps with cancer, I could find another study that says cannabis causes pain and cannabis causes cancer. And so
Yep.
I'm trying to disentangle this. Well, what's the truth here? And then so you need to go into the studies and look at the methodology and how good is the study? Is it accurate? What is it telling me? And I'm plagued by this in cannabis, and obviously everyone else is too. Now, I happen to be fortunate enough to be well trained in this area and how to distinguish what a good study is and what a bad study is. So I think it's incumbent upon me to speak up, and people are relying on a study to say, no, that study's not worth it. It's not accurate, it's not valid.
Hmm.
So I'm reading all these studies and I was trying to understand something and I forget what the issue is, but there's a lot of studies out there where they say cannabis users are more likely to fill in the blank.
XYZ. Right.
And I read a bunch of those and I was interested. There's a lot of controversy around cardiovascular issues, but does it cause bad life outcomes? Does it cause schizophrenia? Does it cause, whatever else? And so again, I go to the methodology and I'm like, well, they say cannabis users. And I'm like, okay, well, how do you define a cannabis user? Because the more anyone understands about cannabis, it's not a yes or no question. It's not a binary choice. Yes, I use cannabis or no, I don't. It's, well, what are your lifetime patterns of use? When you say you used it, is that yesterday? Is that last week? Is it, last month? And was it, a 30% THC? Was it an extract? Was it flower? What else was in there? And the more you know, the more complex that question becomes. So to just say he's a cannabis user, well, what does that mean? And I'm reading the studies and unbelievable. Every study has a completely ad hoc way of defining what a cannabis user is. They provide arbitrary thresholds. There's a lot of studies that if you've ever used cannabis in your life, you're now a cannabis user.
Right.
And then they have, if you've used it in the past year, you're a cannabis user. If you've used it in the past month, you're a cannabis user. If you've used it more than 5 times in the past month, if you've smoked more than 3 joints in the past week. I mean, it's all over the place. And they don't provide, they just kind of they declare what their definition is with any sort of rationale as to why they chose that point. And so now, if, I'm coming to the literature and I'm trying to understand, does cannabis cause heart disease? Well, cannabis users, well, how are you defining a user? This study is using one group of people, this study is using a different people. So you're comparing apples to oranges. Normally, the way research works is you go out there and no one study is going to be definitive, but you look at the body of research. And if you have, say, 8 out of 10 papers tend to agree, and they're all kind of similar, they're looking at similar types of patients, then you can kind of say with some confidence, well, it seems like cannabis is causing heart disease or whatever else. But it turns out every study defines a user differently, and there's no valid, definition. And then that's kind of one piece of it. Now it gets worse, because regardless of how you define it, you come to the studies, and the way a study works is you say, okay, I'm going to say, does cancer cause heart disease? So you say, okay, I got 100 people. And I put the cannabis users into this group, and I put the non-users into this group, and I compare outcomes. If the non-users tended to get heart disease less than the users, then you can conclude that there's a correlation. You can't do causation, but you can say it seems that there's something going on, and cannabis use is correlated with heart disease. So the question here is, when they have their 100 people and they need to divide them and put the users over here, and the non-users over here, how do they determine who is a user and non-user? Most of the time they ask them, do you use cannabis? Now, let's assume we know that they don't have a uniform definition, but just abstract from that issue and say, okay, have you used cannabis more than 15 times in the past month, or whatever your definition is? And they ask that question to people. I use cannabis. I've never told any of my doctors. I hope there's none of my doctors are watching this. I've never told one of my doctors that I use cannabis, because it can't help me. All it can do is hurt me. So I know that I never say that I'm a cannabis user, and I'm not alone. You have anyone who has any sort of potential repercussions is not going to be forthcoming. You have that's a huge portion of people, which means that if you look at those 100 people, and we know that roughly 25 to 30 people have used cannabis in the past month. So that should break out to about 70 people are non-users and 30 people are users. You're going to get something that more like 90 non-users and 10 users, which means that you're going to have a whole bunch of people in the non-user group that are actually users. And the people who are going to end up in the user group are going to tend to be the heavier users, which means it's all messed up. And what you're going to do is you're going to over-report any bad things associated with cannabis. And now you're also going to generalize, because you're going to say cannabis users, and anyone who casually uses are going to say, well, is that me or is that not me? Should I be worried? And so the whole thing is just, it doesn't make sense, and it's completely invalid. So now that's the first way, is self-report. The second way is a lot of people go in and they look at either insurance claims or medical records. Let's stick with insurance claims. Anyone goes, has insurance, you go to the doctor and they say, okay, I treated you for like bronchitis, or I treated you for cancer, or whatever. And there's what's called ICD-9 codes, or International Classification of Disease, or something to that effect, ICD codes. And so there's codes for cannabis. And so they say what the researchers do is they get a whole bunch of records, and this is very easy to do because their database is available. And I just mentioned on LinkedIn today, there was a study done of these researchers wanted to know whether fungal infections more prominent in cannabis users. They had 27 million health insurance claims. And they said, okay, we're going to look for those ICD-9 codes that tag cannabis users. And they did this and they came out with, I forget the exact number, it's like 0.3% or 0.03% of their sample had these tags.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out there are no, this is disease classifications. Using cannabis isn't a disease. It's like saying how many people use aspirin. There's only a code if you're an abuser. The category is for cannabis dependence and abuse or something like that. And then they have different forms of that diagnosed with cannabis use disorder or abuse or dependency or whatever. And there's a whole bunch of codes, but all of them fall under this umbrella category of cannabis disorder dysfunction. And very few people are classified with that. So if they go into this database of 20 million, 27 million people, and they find like 10,000 people or something who have tags, those are only the abusers. Now, the researchers, I believe it was this paper, I have a couple of different papers, so I might confuse them. The researchers don't realize this, and throughout the paper, they're conflating cannabis user with cannabis abuser. And anyone in the cannabis community should be insulted by that because these researchers can't even distinguish the two. But regardless, all of the researchers who are trying to use health claims to do research, they're radically, drastically under capturing cannabis users. And the users they are capturing are the ones who are the abusers who have, for some reason, ended up in the system, been tagged as a user and abuser, which tends to be the ones who are like sent there. They have to go to prison or they, go to, what's your choice, prison or rehab, that type of thing.
And that might be even in conjunction with other substances.
That group of people with the tags, the cannabis use disorder people, the people who have been diagnosed have much higher comorbidities and codependencies and like truancy problems and schizophrenia and polypharmacy, polysubstance abuse. So
Mhm.
it's a very different class group of people. And now the researchers are saying this is representative of all cannabis people.
Yeah, that's nutty. As you're talking about this, like in my brain, okay, so I went home to Colorado to visit my son, and I had Chicky and Pete's. Sorry, Chicky and Pete's, but I got really ill on the plane from your food. Like really ill, throwing up. As soon as they landed, like they had to get me off the plane to the paramedics. They gave me, I think they gave me fentanyl to stop the pain, and they gave me some sort of anti-vomit something or other because I was vomiting. I cracked a rib. I my kidney ruptured. Like that's how much I was vomiting. And being in the air, you can't get any medical attention. There was just nothing they could do. I was like throwing up all over myself, like all over the plane. I felt really bad for the people sitting around me. They did give me a whole like row to suffer, but oh my God, it was the worst experience ever. So they off the plane, gave me injections, got me into the ambulance, took me to the hospital, and they took my oxygen. My oxygen was low. Keep in mind, New Jersey to Colorado,
Yeah.
and all this other stuff going on, and they just didn't know. They thought maybe kidney stones, but it just turns out that I'm pretty sure it was just food poisoning. They kept me overnight because like it was about 12 hours into the hospital stay that I was feeling better, stopped throwing up, everything kind of normalized. But I wasn't holding on to oxygen. My oxygen kept dropping below 80, and they were like, "We can't let you out because your oxygen is really low." And they're like, "It's probably because you smoke cannabis." And I was like, "What do you mean?" Like, I actually don't smoke cannabis, and most people know this about me. I don't like it. It doesn't teach THC and I are not friends. It makes me feel uncomfortable. I feel icky. It lasts an extraordinarily long time. It's not the 2, 3 hour thing. It's more like a 16 hour
Wow.
thing. And I just don't like it. So I was like, what are you talking about? And they're like, well, you tested positive for THC. I do, however, take a broad spectrum THC tincture almost, daily. I do take it daily, and along with some other, CBD, CBG, whatever. But yeah, THC is not something like I'm not a smoker. I don't eat edibles. And I was like, why am I testing positive for THC? And I was like, oh, it's the broad spectrum CBD tincture that's probably, in my system or whatever. And they equated that to me smoking. And I was like, I don't smoke. I don't smoke cigarettes. I don't smoke cannabis. And they were like, really? And I was like, no. And they were just like, they couldn't understand. They thought I was lying, right? Right. I got pink hair, right? I've got tattoos. Yeah, right. You don't smoke cannabis. Of course you smoke cannabis. You're just not telling us the truth. So now I'm pretty sure that I have on my record that I'm a pot smoker, right?
Yep.
But I'm not. So I could my records could be pulled.
Yep.
I've had a lung biopsy for some nodules that I have in my lungs. They're benign and all that, but that's probably also because I'm a pot smoker. And my
Yep.
records could go into one of those studies, and I absolutely am not a cannabis user. Well, not a THC type cannabis user anyway. So that, so you saying all of that makes complete sense to me. And people not wanting to tell their doctors that they utilize cannabis, whether it's for recreation or for medicinal reasons, like it, it's crazy in this day and age that you still can't talk to your doctor and have
Yeah.
them be like, non-judgy. I mean, I get judged on the daily because of my
Yeah.
pink hair. It's like people think I do drugs, people think I sell drugs. I used to deliver pizza a long time ago. I mean, I've had pink hair for like 20 years. More. How old am I? Yeah, 30 years. But yeah, I
Painful
used
to
to
say that,
deliver
isn't
pizza and people would be like, "Hey, do you know where I can get any like acid or Molly?" And I'm like, "No, why would I know that?" And then I'm like, "Oh, right, I have pink hair." Yeah, so that's really interesting that about all the studies. So looking through papers with that kind of lens is super important. And when I was in grad school, if there wasn't something out there to say what threshold I should use for my genetic analysis or whatever, like what are you calling the same genetic identity? Like what are you calling the same? Like how far is the allowance of genetic distance for them to then be called different things versus they are the same thing? There really wasn't any literature out there to tell me what that number is. So I made one up, but I
it?
disclosed, hey, I made this up. I think that 95% similarity, I'm going to call it the same because there wasn't anybody else that had made up that parameter, right? I don't know if it's right or not, but that's what I used. But like they could use cigarette smokers, a heavy smoker. The other thing about cannabis consumers too is a cigarette smoker is going to smoke a half a pack a day or a pack a day. Cannabis consumers are not going to be smoking a pack of joints a day. Like that would be an incredible amount of, there are probably some out there, but you don't buy joints by the pack, by the, 25 or however many cigarettes come in a pack. So lung
I
cancer with cigarettes and talking about giving patients cannabis to smoke. Oh, we don't let patients smoke because we were trying to get them well and smoking is bad for you. Okay, but they're not going to be smoking that much compared to cigarettes.
Plus, there's no connection. They haven't been able to find a connection. But most doctors, it's just the idea is just abhorrent to them of smoking. They would never do it. But kind of going back to that cigarette example, I'd written an earlier kind of briefer criticism of how do you define a cannabis user, and I pointed out like cigarettes, it's kind of standardized. So you have light, medium, and heavy, and you have pack days or whatever, pack years. How many packs have you smoked, and for how long have you smoked? But even on that, cigarettes are pretty much standardized. So even if you say 3 joints, it's like, well, what type of flower?
Mm-hmm. Well, and then there's joints, there's bowls, there's bongs, there's vapes, like there's multiple different ways to consume just a flower product, right?
Yes,
So how
and
are you?
the issue of if you smoke it, suppose it's 1 gram, and suppose it's 20%, so that's 200 milligrams of THC. How much of that actually makes it into your body? Each person is going to be different.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. Same sort of with cigarettes, how much nicotine makes it into your body. And, people drag on their cigarettes differently. People puff on their joints differently. Some people inhale all the way, hold it in. Some
Yeah.
people just draw it into their mouth and let it absorb through their, mucosa in their mouth. But
It's
yeah.
so complicated. I had read, I think Marcus Rogan, I think is the name. He had just published a study just like 2 days ago. I saw a presentation where they're using like a machine to, I believe, smoke and put the output through a filter, analyze the filter. But you
Hmm.
still have, as you said, how deep is the draw? And he had a couple of different patterns where someone takes a couple of quick puffs or fewer long puffs, and starting to look at that. And that's so the problem I had is when I was writing this paper and thinking about cannabis users, well, how should you define a cannabis user? And it becomes there's a lot of papers out there talking about life cycle, lifetime patterns of use.
Hmm.
You have people who are her problem children who smoke a lot in adolescence, and then at some point they grow up and they stop using cannabis. So they have, high use and then it drops off to zero. Some
Hmm.
people start out high and stay high. Some people come in kind of maybe early adult and use moderate amounts. And of course, we're going to be seeing older people coming in later in life. And then
Hmm.
so we have all these just different patterns of like frequency of use and what are they using and how much and all this other stuff. And where was I going with this?
I was wondering if you came up with how to define a cannabis
So,
user.
okay. So, what I'm thinking about, because when I'm reading these papers and I realize no one's defining it consistently, I'm like, okay, well, how would I do it? And now I don't pretend to be an expert, but I obviously know more than most of the people writing the papers. Um, And I'm like, well, how would I do it? And I spent a lot of time doing, reading about lifetime patterns of use and thinking about dosage and everything like that. And so I'm like, okay, it's not really clear. So then I take a step back and say, okay, what's the purpose of defining a cannabis user? What am I trying to get at? And what I'm trying to get at is what is meaningful cannabis use? And by meaningful cannabis use, I mean, if you're studying, does cannabis cause heart disease? What's that threshold where I've smoked enough or used enough that it now causes heart disease? What does that pattern look like? So, how do we distinguish and say, okay, here's the cutoff point? Because if you look at tobacco, someone did the research that says, now doctors probably wouldn't admit this, but if you're less than, say, half a pack a day or a quarter pack a day or whatever that threshold is, there's a cutoff somewhere where they say, if you smoke less than this, it's not, I mean, it's not great. I wouldn't advise it, but it's really not going to cause a lot of problems. So where is that in cannabis? And the problem is it's chicken and egg because you
Hmm.
can't say, okay, 15 days a month, let's say. If you smoke less than every day or 15 times a month, if you smoke less than 15 times a month, then it's okay. Well, how do we get to that number? We need to look at everyone and see who ends up getting it and go back and then define it there. So it's a chicken and an egg. You can't
You
define
flip
it
the.
until yes, you can't define it until you know what it is, but you don't know what it is until you've actually looked at it. And so it's
Mm.
not so easy. And I came up with this kind of relatively early on in writing this analysis. And so it just kind of kept getting messier and messier.
So is true. I mean, that's cannabis is messy. It is like it doesn't fit neatly into a nature box. It doesn't fit neatly into a usage group. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It's got all these repetitive portions of the genome. Like it's just a crazy
Um,
plant. Yeah, it's just all it's all very complex. Cannabis, what is a cannabis user? I don't know if are you familiar with the work that Riley Kirk and Miyabi Shields have been doing where they've been surveying stoners, what they call stoners. Like they want to take back that word. Like it's not a dirty word. If you smoke cannabis, then you do. And if you're using it to treat, your neurodiversity or your ADHD, whatever, like it's so what, you know? And if it's helping you, then great. So they want to take back the word stoner and make it be normalized because there are so many people that use it not only on a daily basis, but several times a day to feel better or
yeah.
even normal. And they functioning without it. And when we know it's the ECS now, if your ECS is not functioning correctly, you supplement it with cannabis, you can all of a sudden feel much more normal, together, focused, whatever the case may be. And so they've been surveying at this point tens of thousands of people who
Wow.
are stoners and asking
Yeah.
them questions like, how often do you partake? What kinds of products do you use? What times of day do you use your products? Do you wake up first thing? That's what you do. Is it the middle of the day? Is it before bed? And just all of these questions, like really just digging into who are the people that are using, how are they using, and in what capacity are they utilizing cannabis, which I think is just amazing. And they're finding out all kinds of things,
Yeah.
like 16% of people don't feel any effects from edibles, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I
So,
know. I have a friend who can't feel them.
yeah. So have you looked at any of their work at all?
I haven't. I know that they've done a lot of really interesting stuff. I haven't been following it, but
Mm.
yeah, that sounds really fascinating. I just kind of a side rant is I think a lot about there's this issue like in medicine. Does your doctor have to have had experienced pain in order to be a good pain doctor? And I know my brother has had experiences where he's trying to describe his pain to his pain doctor. And he said, I'm trying to describe how horrible it is, how intense it is, and their eyes glaze over. And he said, it's clear to me that they have no idea what I'm talking about. Now, it's hard for him or the doctor to be in this position where they just can't fathom what he's trying to say. How can he treat them? Now, I don't necessarily think that, a cancer doctor has to have cancer in order to be able to treat it in its patients. But I think in a lot of cases, what disturbs me is there's so much research, and especially the anti-cannabis research, that are done by researchers who have never used cannabis and don't know the first thing about it. And I find that really disturbing.
It's almost like when women try to describe menstrual pain to men, that it can be debilitating and that it can be as intense as a heart attack. And, they have the little device that they make their boyfriends or husbands strap on. They turn it to one and the guy's knees buckle and he's in pain. And it's like that this is one. You haven't even made it past. It goes all the way up to 10, bro. And we still go to work and we, go about our daily business and we take care of the kids and we do all the things that we're supposed to do, and we don't often complain about it or let anybody know, that we're going through this kind of pain. And it's not until the man feels what we feel that they're like, oh shit, you should get a trophy and a cookie and let me help you because this sucks. I wouldn't be able to go to work like this. And so, like, I kind of see where you're going. If you don't understand that level, then it's
Oh,
really.
kind of an application of this is my recent research is on the placebo effect. And I'd done a lot of work. I kind of stumbled onto it and I found it really interesting. And I was reading about it for some reason. And then I was reading about cannabis trials and also their psychedelics trials. And they say, if you do an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, which means for anyone who doesn't know, that's placebo controlled, that if the way it works is you give someone a drug and you want to make sure that the improvement in the patient is due to the drug and not to some other kind of placebo or psychological effect. Then what you need to do is you need to run the study and you give some people a placebo, which is essentially a sugar pill, and
Mhm.
you give other people the treatment. Now, the people who get the placebo have to think that they're getting the real medication,
Mhm.
and then you track to see what happens. And so if you start out, something typical would be, okay, they start with a level of pain of 10, and the idea is to get it down to 0. And the therapeutic reduces the pain from a 10 to say a 4. But the people who got the placebo, who think they're getting medicated, they convince themselves, and there's very real mechanisms that they've learned about. So they go from a 10 to say a 7. So they didn't get the therapeutic, but they're still getting benefits. So can you say that the actual therapeutic reduced it to, what did I say, a
Four.
7?
Four.
4, thank you. They reduced it to a 4, whereas the placebo got it down to a 7. So it wasn't a difference of 6, it's more like a difference of 3. And so
Mhm.
when you're doing these randomized control trials and doing the placebo control, again, the people who get the placebo, for this to work and to be able to isolate the effects only due to the therapeutic, you need to make sure that the people who get the placebo think that they got the therapeutic, because if they know they got the sugar pill, they're like, okay, I didn't get anything, and they're not going to get that natural kind of self-healing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I read about placebo-controlled trials for decades. I won't tell you how long, decades. So now I'm reading about cannabis and especially psychedelics, and like, okay, we're doing now, there's a lot of studies and they're trying to do trials to establish drug efficacy. And they said, okay, we did a placebo-controlled study of psilocybin. I'm like, what did you use for a placebo? And so I'm going, and it's the same thing for cannabis. Yeah, we used a placebo. I'm like, what did you use as a placebo? Because anyone who's taken cannabis or psychedelic knows if they've gotten the drug or the sugar pill. You can't get a sugar
Mm-hmm.
pill and think, oh, geez, this is actually psilocybin, and now I'm getting this trip. You can't do it because it's so distinct. Anyone who's ever had it will know that they didn't get the treatment. And in all the studies, they say, yeah, we used a placebo. I'm like, what did you use as a placebo? We used a placebo.
We
So
used a sugar pill, duh.
I'm
Great.
like, I'm like, you've never used psilocybin before, have you? Or you've never used cannabis, because anyone who has would know that you can't do it. And so that's kind of the latest stuff that I'm working on right now. And I'm writing this up. And it's shocking to me that I'm sure it never occurred to the researchers, because they're like, yeah, you do a placebo-controlled study. You just give them a placebo. What are you
Right.
doing there?
Yeah. A drop of water instead of a drop of acid. And it's like, they're
And
gonna
that's
know. As soon as they don't get that icky, drippy, trippy feeling 20 minutes into it, they're gonna know. That's a really good observation because, like, if you were testing ibuprofen, you take two ibuprofen, you don't feel it. Like,
right,
nothing else happens
right.
except your pain lessens. And you
It's
can say, oh, my headache went away. Cool, it worked. But yeah, that icky, drippy, trippy feeling, followed by visuals, and then it ramps up to, your popcorn is breathing. Yeah, what are you using as a placebo? I love that. So, can they do any meaningful stuff with a blind placebo-controlled study for these psychedelics and stuff like that, do you think, or is there another way around to do that, or
So
can it?
this is what I'm writing up right now, and I've done a lot of reading. And so a placebo is also called an inactive placebo, which means it's a sugar pill. There's nothing in it. You can give someone an active placebo, which actually has some substance in it, but it's just not therapeutic. So, for example, so what they've done is they've tried to use different active placebos, and something like maybe niacin, for anyone who's never had it, causes you to flush, and it causes your skin can kind of like tingle or whatever. I take niacin, and it's very different from a psychedelic. So I would know. But they've done trials, and they've tried to use a bunch of different types of active substances which give funky effects. But again, if you know, you know. And so they've tried to use this stuff, and they admit, yeah, if we ask the people, did you know, or what did you think you got, the placebo or the active treatment? They know that they got the placebo. So they've tried to use all this stuff, and nothing seems to work. And so the point that I'm trying to make in this paper that I'm writing up is that you can't do it. And so you can't, traditionally, the way our healthcare system works and the way it's evolved is using randomized controlled trials to establish efficacy. And this was established by the FDA over a process, but cemented in place, I believe, in 1970 or so. It's considered, the RCT is considered the gold standard for establishing therapeutic efficacy. That's what the FDA requires you do when you're bringing a new drug through the FDA approval process. And so when doctors are trying to establish credibility, whether or not they believe that a drug will work, what they're looking for is large scale RCTs. They want hundreds or thousands of people to go through these trials, be placebo controlled. You have your placebo group, you have your therapeutic group, and it shows beyond a reasonable doubt that therapy is causing an effect. So this is
Mm-hmm.
what everyone's looking for. And my argument has long been that you can't do that in cannabis because people know. And studies also show that if you get what's called unblinding, it's no longer a blinded or study where people know, then it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I argue that the alternative is obviously real world evidence, which is increasingly available. Real world evidence is all the observational studies. Anyone who's used like a tracking device, or you have all your wearables where they're collecting data, or they can go and they can look at insurance claims or health records or whatever and do epidemiological comparisons
Mm-hmm.
of trying to compare how people, with this treatment did versus people with that treatment or whatever. But in cannabis, what's more relevant is using, say, a tracking device or working with your doctor and having them gather information over time. And you can compare people who use cannabis to people who didn't use cannabis, or you could use a person as their own control and say, okay, well, we're using, a period where we're using cannabis. Now you go off cannabis or psychedelics and don't use it, and kind of compare how those work. Now, you still can't get blinding. So
Mm-hmm.
these are called, when you do these studies where a person serves as their own control, where they're tracking their own use, what they do is they randomize. I guess what they do is they give you like 4 different bottles. And they say, okay, for the first 6 weeks, take this bottle. For the next 6 weeks, take this bottle,
Mm-hmm.
and it's randomized there. And then you're reporting what's going on. And so they can kind of determine that way and compare, but you're still not going to get the blinding. But, if I'm comparing how I feel based on the medication versus not the medication, if it's working, then, great. And you can also compare, you can now aggregate together, you get 100 different people who are all doing the same thing. You can kind of compare the different experiences. Or I guess you can compare them to people who didn't use it at all. So
Mm-hmm.
those would be N of 1 trials. But also, as I said, like the wearables are tracking and reporting, and you have a lot of people who are working with doctors, and the doctors are collecting information on them, or they're journaling or tracking the information themselves, and we know it works. Another thing that you could do that I think the insurance companies really, really need to do is they need to get, say, a cannabis user using it for pain and someone who has the same type of pain who's not using cannabis, and compare for a period of time, a year, 2 years, what do their healthcare claims look like?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You don't even need randomization. You just see that the cannabis person isn't going into the hospital every other month, or they're on way fewer medications, or
Mm-hmm.
you need to have fewer procedures done or whatever. And so if you do kind of a long-term and extended period of time capturing all of their expenditures, because we know cannabis addresses pain, it addresses sleep, it addresses mood disorders, all these different things where another person's going to be on antidepressants, they're going to be on pain medications, they're going to be on sleep medications, then clearly the cannabis person is going to be saving money relative to the non-cannabis person.
Yeah. And the thing about doing, and I love the point that you made. Like, people are going to know if they're given a placebo versus not placebo. People have, and they can express their experience. They can say how much their pain is, or if they felt any, if they can feel cannabis or not feel cannabis. So we've got this idea of being conscious and aware of everything that's going on. You have another paper that you wrote about pets, right? So, yeah, pets, animals don't have the same communication level as people do. I mean, depending on what you subscribe to, they don't speak English, right? They can't tell you how much they're in pain. But with pets, you can, I don't know, like, I'm thinking, okay, so you could do trials with pets or with animals, and see the outcomes of a control versus a non-control, right?
The research I did on that I summarized for that article on pets was mostly looking at kind of what are the practices, what's being done. It turns out that dogs have more CB1 receptors in their brain than people do.
Mm-hmm.
and they're more sensitive to it. And in animals, most of the products out there are CBD products.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at, it's very interesting comparing laws between the US, Canada, and Europe on whether or not it's legal, that pet products are legal, whether or not livestock products are legal, whether or not you're allowed to have cannabis products in food. So putting hemp in feedstock, for example, is, and I forget exactly what the differences are, but there's differences between the US, the UK, or was it UK or all of Europe? I think it's Europe, in Canada, and whether or not you're allowed to have pet products and whether or not you're allowed to have cannabis in food. The concern there is if you feed the cows cannabis, then when people eat the meat, they're going to get trace cannabinoids transferred to them
Oh no. Getting high off the beef.
or in eggs or whatever. And so that's a huge
Milk.
concern. In a lot of places, products aren't legal. In certain places, vets are not allowed to advise their patient. So if you have a patient comes in who has, the dog is the patient, but you have the pet owner comes in and says, I'm using, can you sell me CBD? No, that you're not allowed to do that. I'm using CBD for my dog. Can you give me guidance? In a lot of places, they're not allowed to do that. And it turns out, obviously, that where it's been legalized, they're more likely to allow it for pets. One of the things I found most interesting, though unsurprising in retrospect, is that the people most likely to give their animals cannabis are people who use cannabis themselves. It's
Um,
obvious once you think about it.
yeah, I have a wiener dog, and of course, well, I used to have three, but now I'm down to one. But CBD for their back problems is great. For their anxiety issues is great. And I think CBD for pets is great. As you mentioned, dogs have more CB1 receptors in their brains. So, and I've had this conversation several times on LinkedIn about giving dogs THC and whether or not they can die from it, because it's not just more CB1 receptors. From my understanding, they're also in the centers of the brain that control things like breathing and heart rate. So technically, if they have enough THC, they could potentially stop breathing or their heart could stop, right? In the same way that opioids do that to us with our opioid receptors. And so, the vets, I have a friend who's a vet and she's like, yeah, marijuana toxicity is a thing. Like we see it all the time because pets get into the edibles or whatever, right? My friend's dog she almost died. She didn't, but she got into the spent material that they had been infusing butter with. So it was
Yeah.
covered with butter, but she was eating the plant material because it was covered in butter, and that's yummy, right? But she almost died. But I can't find in the literature. I found one paper where the dogs that were being studied, two of the dogs died. Both of them had gotten into edibles, but it didn't say, I don't think it said what the edible was, because what if it's a whole bar of chocolate? We know that chocolate is not good for dogs and they can die from eating chocolate, right? So again, that's another, conflating thing that makes cannabis hard to study. So in your opinion, and I don't know, maybe you've read more than I have on pets, do you think that that THC, obviously it affects them more because they have more receptors, and so they have trouble walking, they have trouble with their motor skills, they have, they lose control of their bowels, they have trouble breathing and things like that. But do you think that THC type cannabis can kill dogs or cats?
I read about that and I don't remember what the conclusion was, kind of what happens if they consume too much.
Or if
Would
you
I,
get them high, like breathing the smoke into their, noses or whatever.
yeah, all I know is that predominantly, if not all, cannabis products for pets are CBD,
Hmm.
not THC. And
Right.
I think that the literature, what I read is very specific that dogs are different, and it might not be the same for, say, cats and other
Hmm.
animals. However, just because of, the scariness of THC, that's my presumption. that the products out there tend to be CBD products.
Because I've heard people say like they give their dog cannabis all the time and they're fine, they're not dead. But then I think, okay, but if it affects them differently and more strongly than it affects us, and we don't know what a dose is for a dog, right? And they don't have the communication abilities to say, I don't like this. We like it, so they must like it, kind of thing. And I feel bad that they can't tell you. Like,
Yeah.
please don't do that to me because it makes me feel like shit. I can't walk. I can't, I'm pissing on myself, whatever the case may be. And so it's I kind of lean towards don't give your pets marijuana, like CBD products, okay, no problem. But yeah, the THC receptors in the brain is like where I'd be like, oh, I don't think that's a good idea. Do you have thoughts on that or no?
I tend to be conservative in things like that, so I tend to say no.
Hmm.
It's not a good idea, but that's just me.
And it's not for being like, anti-cannabis. Obviously, neither of us are anti-cannabis. It's just
You
like,
don't know. You don't
yeah, and
know.
people don't understand that dogs are not experiencing cannabis the same way we are because of the difference in our endocannabinoid systems, right?
I think you would need to do an experiment where you made it available to the dog and he tried it and he got however wacky in his sensation. And then after that passed, you then still, it was still available to him, and to see him choose to do that again,
Hmm.
just that it was pleasurable. And if he chose not to do it again, then it would suggest it's not pleasurable. But
Hmm.
unless, I mean, you can watch him and you can sit there and be spaced out and you can think, well, I like it when I'm spaced out, but maybe the dog doesn't feel the same way. So because he, as you said, he can't communicate, you really don't know. So the
So
only thing I can think of is to have him tell you by choosing to do it again or not doing it again.
yeah, maybe like have a hot box and then invite them in and see if they want to do it. No, see whether
Yeah,
they back
I've
off.
done that.
Oh yeah.
The
Um,
other thing, the last thing I found really, other than, okay, most of the vets said they want more education because they didn't feel well enough informed. That they had a lot of customers or patients coming in asking about it, and they didn't feel that they knew enough. So they wanted their vet association to make more education available. I thought that was interesting. But the other interesting thing is that cannabis is used historically on animals, and what they mention in the literature is horses.
I've talked to Stephanie McGrath, who does research on dogs and CBD and, conditions like arthritis. And they've had a lot of success showing that CBD does help dogs with arthritis. And they do, walking trials and things like that to measure, how the dog's movements improve or don't over time. They do the placebo versus not placebo. They do tinctures and they have like an ear like rub that they
Yeah.
put on their ear that gets absorbed into the skin. So if anyone's interested in that research, it's Stephanie McGrath. She's a vet at CSU, Colorado State University, worth looking into. You mentioned schizophrenia, and I feel like this is kind of a catch-22, right? Are people who are pre
Predisposed genetically.
predisposed to schizophrenia, are those people, is cannabis, if they use cannabis, is cannabis pushing them into schizophrenia, or are they self-medicating because the schizophrenia is starting to rear its head and they feel weird and so they're using cannabis to try and feel better and then it turns into this cycle? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I've read a lot on this, and my opinion, based on what I've read, is that cannabis does not cause schizophrenia. If people are predisposed towards schizophrenia, then using cannabis will cause the onset sooner than otherwise. My understanding is that if you're predisposed towards schizophrenia, it's probably going to come out. I don't think if you have the predisposition, you would not get it under ideal circumstances. I think that you probably will. And I think it probably comes out, and I'm not so sure, but say in your late teens or early 20s or whatever. So the point is, if you start using it, instead of getting, starting to manifest at say 20, you might start to manifest at say 15 or 16 if you use it early enough. I think my sense is, I haven't read this anywhere, but I could imagine that if you're predisposed towards it, yes, you're feeling kind of funky and you're seeking relief. And so you might turn to cannabis and find that cannabis relieves those funky symptoms, even though you haven't yet know, you don't know what that's due to. So they're probably using it earlier, which is that, and then subsequently it becomes manifest. And so because the use predates the manifestation of this tendency, people are blaming cannabis on it.
So you think that cannabis is a trigger for something that is inevitable. If you,
Yes.
so the people who are getting schizophrenia from cannabis use were inevitably going to become schizophrenic anyway
Yeah.
without the cannabis at some point.
Now, there's something else I want to add, and that's if you look at the research for, say, I believe it's opioids. And the problem there is, so if you say, well, does cannabis get people off of opioids? Most studies show that people are using opioids. If they start using cannabis, they'll either reduce or stop using opioids altogether. But that's not everyone. And for some people, so they kind of work together. So if you're using cannabis, you need less opioids to get the same effect. Because they work together, they can enhance one another. So if you're so inclined, when you start using cannabis, it makes the opioids feel better. So now you might end up ramping up both. And there's certain people who end up kind of going off the deep end because they're co-using both and they end up using too much of either one or both. So it's not helping them. So there's certain people who are using both who are not helped by it, though many people are helped by using cannabis and opioids. The thing that's really interesting is if you look at the pathways where this is all kind of functioning in your brain, it turns out that, I don't know if it's always, but sometimes people who are predisposed towards opioid use are also predisposed towards cannabis use. So it's kind of the same mechanism there is feeding both drives. So it's not one causing the other, it's something else causing both. And
Hmm.
it could be kind of, and I don't know, I'm speculating, but if you look at people with the predispositions towards schizophrenia, maybe some of those kind of with that predisposition also comes a predisposition towards using cannabis. So the
Hmm.
cannabis isn't causing schizophrenia, it's something else causing both.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's something that's going to keep me up at night thinking about. Thanks a lot, Ruth. Um,
Cannabis is good for sleep.
um, well, I was talking to Ethan Russo and he said CBD is not even that great and CBN's not, well, CBN doesn't make you sleepy. It's the oxidized sesquiterpenes that are actually making you sleepy. It's not, even though there's, but anyway, he said CBG is like 4 times stronger than CBD in terms of, anti-anxiety and anti-inflammatory and all that stuff. And so I think there's a lot of potential for CBG. And I take CBG every day. It makes me feel good. It helps me focus and helps with old lady pains and whatnot. Is there anything else like you want to talk about? Because you do so much interesting stuff, and like I said, I'd love to open up your brain and have a look if it was a TV screen.
I think one of the things I think a lot about is, again, kind of how to communicate with people who aren't in cannabis about cannabis and how to
Hmm.
kind of change the way. What do we say that's going to convince them? And, I think about doctors a lot. My dad he's a private practice physician. But if you think about people in the healthcare industry, I've thought that it's not the healthcare industry that's going to move into cannabis voluntarily. What's going to happen is patients are going to go to their doctors and say, I use cannabis, can you help me or can you incorporate it? And the doctors are going to be forced to either accommodate them or lose them. So I think it's going to be the use of the patients that's going to force the industry to kind of adapt to them. Because I grew up in a medical family, there's a lot of things that people who aren't in the medical world don't understand just because they wouldn't. So my dad, not that I'm biased or anything, but he was a quintessential doctor. Um,
Mm-hmm.
really, really amazing. And by the time he died in 2005, and he died, he's never going to retire. He's still practicing. And he was on his third generation of
Mm-hmm.
patients. So he had families. He had seen
Mm.
through three generations. And every day of his life, he lived in fear of being sued and losing his house and his retirement. So medical malpractice is a primary concern. And this is for someone who was an amazing doctor. So this issue of medical malpractice is foremost in the minds of doctors and in the system they're in. And what you have right now, you have this trend that's been going on for decades where private practice physicians are now in the minority and they're a dying breed, and doctors are being pushed into, say, hospital groups or larger practices or whatnot. And when you have, say, a hospital or a larger practice, they have very firm policies. And
Yeah.
a lot of cases, because of the Schedule 1, maybe that'll change if cannabis gets rescheduled. But because of the Schedule 1 nature, hospitals won't treat or deal with cannabis because they can't afford to. And a lot of it has to do with malpractice. And
Mm.
so you have a lot of doctors out there who probably would otherwise be open to it, where it's just not a question. They have no choice. They cannot participate because they work for an employer who won't let them, or, they can't get malpractice insurance.
Mm-hmm.
There's another thing to understand kind of along that same vein is if you are sued for malpractice, what the people are going to ask you, the board or whoever it is that you're going under or against, they're going to ask what's the standard of care. And if you say, they'll say, is cannabis a standard of care for treating, say, pain? Their cohort, their peers are going to say, no, that's not the standard of care. In
Right.
which case the doctor who is using it is now kind of laid out to dry, or he loses. So there's a lot of things in the system that's preventing doctors who otherwise might be very open to it from participating. Now the other thing is, doctors take an oath, the Hippocratic oath, first do no harm.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I actually, I'll not discuss that. It's not necessarily relevant. So what I will say is, since I've been in cannabis and done a lot of research, there have been people who've come to me who want my advice on using cannabis. And they say, what should I take and how should I take it and whatnot? And that's a really heavy burden. That's a responsibility. And if you have a good doctor who, believes in do no harm and who wants to do what's in the best interest of his patient, if he doesn't understand cannabis, that's a really difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And
Now, Now, there's a lot. I talk about this quite a bit, but there's a lot of medications that are not a one and done. You go to the doctor and you say, "Hey, I'm depressed," and the doctor says, "Okay, let's try this medication because it seems to work well for a lot of people." They prescribe it to you. You come back 3 weeks later and you say, "I hate this. I've gained 20 pounds. I'm having nightmares," and they say, "Okay, so that one wasn't for you. Let's try this other medication." They prescribe it to you. You come back 3 weeks later and you say, "I'm feeling much better, but I'm still not there yet." And so they might up your dose. They might add an additional medication that will enhance the effects that you're looking for. And I kind of feel like cannabis sits in that space where you can't, like, you wouldn't say take 2 ounces of blue dream per week or whatever. You would say, okay, so here's something that a lot of people utilize for this condition. Try it. Or this is an indica and this is sativa. Try both. We'll see how, if there's one that works better over another. And then we can start to dial in and to THC, CBD, terpenes, whatever is in that thing that you find pleasurable or works well for your pain or whatever. So it's not like all of the onus is on the doctor to prescribe this thing and make it work. It's also the patient who needs to kind of pay attention, like Is it better in the morning? Is it better at night? Medications come with instructions too, like take in the morning on a full stomach with a full glass of water, or take before eating, or take at night. Don't operate heavy equipment. There's all these things, and I feel like that people don't make that connection with regular medications with cannabis, that you kind of need to pay attention if you're looking for an effect. It might not be the first time that you consume that you hit the nail on the head. You might need to do some experimentation to figure out what is working for you better.
Yes. So my first comment is all the criticisms they make of cannabis are true of all medications.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like it because it's psychoactive. It's like, really? There's no other psychoactive, medication out there? How about all the opioids? How about, the benzos and everything else? They're all psychoactive.
Ambien.
You have no problem with any of those. And, yes, it's, cannabis is personalized medicine. You have to figure out what works. Well, as you said, most drugs, you go through some sort of trial and error process.
Mm-hmm.
There's two things here that are interconnected that's different about cannabis that doesn't apply to other medications. One is for all other medications, the doctor has training. They
Mm-hmm.
know, they've studied like medical pathways or how, opioids work or whatever, and they have the biology and the pharmacodynamics and everything for the way other medications work. The other thing is, and this is really, really important, is that when you look at all medications out there, in order to get onto the market, they have to go through the FDA approval process. You go through phase 1 studies that show safety. You go through phase 2 studies, which show efficacy. You're doing dosing. You go through phase 3 studies, which are kind of larger scale. And while you're doing all those studies are creating this body of research.
Mm-hmm.
So now when the drug finally makes it to market and the doctor needs to know, okay, who are the patients who should be targeted, are the most likely beneficiaries who, the on-label use, who would this help? And how do I guide them in dosing? All of that information is in this repository of information that was created by having the drug pass through the FDA trial. None of that information exists for cannabis because there's one Epidiolex, but really no FDA approved drugs. So when a doctor says, okay, I want to guide my patient in the use of, Blue Dream or whatever else, first of all, he hasn't been taught the ECS, the endocannabinoid system. He hasn't been taught about any of how it works in the body. And there's no repository of studies that will help him guide patients in figuring out which products to use and how much and when.
Right. And it's really unfortunate. I mean, the ECS I go back and forth between this. The ECS was discovered in 1996, which is relatively recent. And it still hasn't made a big splash into the textbooks, into the anatomy and physiology textbooks. Yeah, I went back and I looked at my anatomy and physiology textbooks because I'm weird and I keep all of my textbooks from, 1992, and no, it wasn't in there. Look at textbooks from when I taught in my master's and my PhD graduate research. It's in there, but in some of them it's like a paragraph, in some of them it's a couple of pages, but really, like, it's the governing system for all other systems in the body. It should be front and center. And Ethan Russo is like, well, if we're going to put that in the textbook, what are we going to take out? I'm like, why do we need to take anything out? And
Yeah.
honestly, if I was going to take anything out, it would be the lymphatic system. Like, it's already like that skinny. Like, who's going to miss it? Nobody learns anything on that anyway. But like, yeah, it should be added in. But how often is a textbook completely rewritten or a whole another chapter put in? It hasn't been yet. But you can take, there are places that you can take a class on the ECS now, right? That you can take a
Yeah.
semester or whatever. Probably not enough, but why hasn't it been added to the textbooks? Is it just because textbooks don't get rewritten, or?
My understanding is that you have a board that decides on what's going to be in the curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
and that the board would then have to make that conscious decision to add information about the ECS. And as Ethan said, their curriculum is already packed. And so if they're going to add something, they need to take something out. And I'm sure there's a whole bunch of politics in all of that. And it's just, I think it's going to be a very hard process. And I would argue that given the nature of the ECS, and as you said, it's integrated with all other systems, they would need, a substantial amount of time devoted to it. And then, then once they do that, the textbooks will come.
He also made the point that, medical students, and you make the point too, they're already like got this huge burden of coursework and all of the things that they need to get through medical school, but also they're in medical school. It's kind of to be expected that they, I would think that most people going into medical school understand that this is a huge undertaking. It's going to take basically your whole life away from you while you're in medical school for the whole undergrad, pre-med, whatever you're do after that. You do your rounds or whatever they do it on Grey's Anatomy. But I mean, they're already. What's one more thing?
Again, I bet there's a huge amount of politics in there. And
Yeah, it's just.
everything else in cannabis, you can't escape that.
But you also can't escape the fact that the ECS has been established as the system that governs all the other systems. Your whole existence is the balance, the homeostasis is central to you surviving, right? Like you can't survive if you're not in homeostasis. If your temperature gets too high, you die. If you get too cold, you die. If your heart doesn't work, you die. If your brain's not functioning, you die. And the ECS is governing all of those things, keeping everything in balance and checking it and reacting to it and bringing it back into balance constantly. So it seems very odd to me that that is the most extremely important system in your body to function. It should be taught, and I don't understand why it isn't. And I think everybody's in the same boat. Like everybody's like, why aren't doctors being trained?
I think everyone in cannabis, it's obvious to them because they understand. But I mean, I'm constantly struck by when you talk to anyone not in cannabis, how little they know about it. This is our world and it's the water we swim in, but for most people, it's not. And most people have no idea what's going on.
I mean, haven't people gone before these people and said, "Did you know that we have an endocannabinoid system that governs all the other systems in the body?"
I'm sure a lot of people, I mean, look at human behavior. Uh, most people, they have their ideas and they believe they're right and they don't want to be challenged. And, just because you tell them something, I was told for, I won't tell you how many decades, that cannabis will cause brain rot. And I believed it.
Yeah.
Someone came along and actually I had someone most of my life telling me, no, that's all wrong. And I just utterly dismissed that person because I mean, the government told me this. Would the government lie to me? Really?
Yes.
Like,
Yeah, yeah, that it's gonna rot your brain. This is your brain on drugs. It looks like a fried egg, right? And you're gonna turn into a useless stoner that can't function in society, won't get off the couch, is lazy,
a
and
or
very,
rapist.
yeah, rapist. And come to find out, it's a neuroprotective properties and can save your brain, can, reduce seizures and do all these things. Yeah, and it's hard once you're in the industry and you learn all these things, it's really hard to understand that people don't have that same exposure that we do. But also there's people in the cannabis industry that also you can't talk to about cannabis because they have their strong beliefs about cannabis and they will not let it go. The whole conversation surrounding CHS being a flooding of the endocannabinoid system and tipping it over a certain point versus it's pesticides. It's got to be the pesticides. It couldn't possibly be the cannabis. Cannabis is a plant and it's healthy and it's good for you and we have an ECS. And why do we have an ECS if cannabis wasn't going to help us and it couldn't possibly be the cannabis? It has to be the pesticides, right? So there's even people in the cannabis world that you just can't even change their minds, right?
It's human nature. It's human nature.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think about the whole CHS conversation?
I think like autism, I think there's probably a lot of different factors involved. What I've read is it's based on people who have used a lot of it over an extended period of time. maybe you can develop an allergy. Certainly for every substance out there, there's going to be someone who doesn't work with,
Mm-hmm.
you
And
know,
it's plant. It's a plant. Lots of plants have adverse effects on people, whether
yeah.
yeah.
And I've experienced things where, something that I've used or eaten or whatever for forever, all of a sudden becomes toxic.
Mm-hmm.
You can develop an allergy. You can have a genetic predisposition. Epigenetics, it's something triggers it. The potential's there and it gets triggered. Again, I think it's going to be like autism where there's just a lot of different factors going on.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I will say is while you're seeing a lot of people as a percentage of the population, it's probably kind of small. And one of the things that really, really bothers me, it kind of changes. So, one of my pet peeves is the people who are anti cannabis. They say, oh my God, our visits are up by 500% since cannabis was legalized. And it's like, okay, can we get some numbers here? So is that, from 1 to 6 people? It was one person and now there's 6 people? Or is it
Mm-hmm.
a million in that, was 1 million, now it's 6 million? And when they use a percent, it generally means the absolute numbers are too small. And I was trying to get numbers on what are the numbers behind this. It turns out the number of people who go to the ER every year because they've eaten Tide Pods, there's like hundreds of thousands of people. And if
Yeah.
so, if you were to put it in context, and this is the problem, is too many. I'm a numbers person, and all my life I've worked with numbers, and I've created numbers, and I've worked in litigation context where having a number is very important. And whenever I see a number, my first question is, where did that come from? And most of the time, it's completely ad hoc, and there's no real basis to it. But whenever I see a number, I'm like, okay, where does that come from? And I look at the way that information is presented because I've also have a lot of experience in how you present information in order to make the point you want. And I was working with an analyst at some point, and they essentially said, do you want me to lie with the numbers to do our analysis? And my point was, no, you can make the numbers appear, the true numbers appear however you want, depending on how you frame it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the way numbers are framed in the industry, I mean, it's no different from any other industry. But most people don't have a number sense and they don't understand when they say this increased by 500%. Well, let's ask about the actual numbers. If you say it increases the risk of, heart attacks by 20%, well, did it increase it from 0.1% to 0.2%? That's very different. And there's a lot of that going on in Canvas.
Yeah, it was you that posted the 4 different graphs of data to visualize it
Yes.
4 different ways, which I thought was really interesting. And I almost asked a question that was really dumb, so I'm glad I didn't ask. But I was going to ask if they were the same data sets, obviously not. But I have this conversation with my dad, who's really smart. He's a geologist. He says things like, "Well, the average climate or the average temperature of the Earth is only two degrees warmer." So, that's nothing. And I'm like, yeah, but if you look at the actual like high temperatures and low temperatures, they are much, much higher and much, much lower. But the average is still like the difference between the average of 49 and 51 is 50. But also the average between 1 and 100 is also 50. So those two things are very, very different. And so I don't know why he doesn't get it, but he doesn't see it like that. And I'm like, yeah, you actually have to look at the raw numbers as well as here's the summary.
Yes. And I hate averages for that reason. I'll give you the classic example I always use. Suppose you're looking at height and you want to know what the average height is. And suppose everyone in the room is 5.5 feet tall. That's very different from having half the people be 4 feet tall and half the people be 6 feet tall. It's the same average, but erratically, what do you need the number for? Are you trying to make clothes for people? Do you make it for the average person? Well, there is no average person. Yeah.
Okay, so is there anything else that you want to talk about? Is there anything you want to ask me while we have the last few minutes?
I want to know what you're most excited about in cannabis.
Oh goodness. Most excited about. I real things that I'm really passionate about I is protection. So protection for breeders for their intellectual property. I do believe that breeding cannabis is an art form and that art should be protected. And unfortunately, the way that it's been illegal for decades, breeders don't have any protections. They can't just release or let people grow a strain without it being released everywhere. Like it'll just leave and they don't get paid for it. It'll get renamed, it'll get recirculated, it'll get, and because we can grow by cloning, you buy one cut, grow it into a mother, cut, and you can just keep that in perpetuity, for however long. And I find that incredibly unfair because as an artist, if somebody wants to, they could lift, a high resolution graphic of a picture of mine. They can print it and they can sell it. However, if I catch them doing it, I can sue the shit out of them because they're making money off of my creation. And I think that cannabis breeders should have that protection as well. So that's one thing I'm super passionate about. The
Let
other
me
thing
let me ask, when you say the breeders, are you talking about genetics or the genotype or the phenotype?
I'm talking about so a breeder who selects two plants, two phenotypes that they like, they cross them, they do a pheno hunt, they pick an offspring that they like and, enter it into a cup or, a competition or something like that. It's very popular. And they want other people to be able to grow it. Um, right now, that's a gamble because they can sell a cut for, 1,000, 2,000, $10,000. But once it's gone, and all the breeders kind of know this, it's gone. Like it's out of their control. People are going to breed with it, recut it, share it with people, sell it, whatever. And all of the, most of the breeders are just like, well, that's just the way it is. And I'm like, but it shouldn't be that way. Like there's no reason for you not to get paid for your hard work. There's no reason that you can't keep the lights on because people steal your shit. And so that's one thing that I'm super passionate about. Another thing that I'm super passionate about is figuring out, everyone says strain names don't matter because you have no idea what you're buying. You could be getting Blue Dream. It could just say Blue Dream, you're getting something completely different. I would like to bring in genetic analysis to be
Yeah,
able to determine what do you have.
yeah,
Does your Durban poison look like most of the Durban poison out there, or is it something completely different?
yeah,
Or does it map onto something that is out there, like Blue Dream? You've been
yeah,
growing Blue Dream, but you've been calling it Durban poison. You've got to relabel it. It's Blue Dream, and this problem is not unique to the cannabis industry. We went through this with grapes and olives and all kinds of stuff. Um, because all grapes and olives kind of look really similar, just like all cannabis kind of looks really similar, and they sorted it out. This grape and this grape, they're named the same thing but they're very different, or this grape and this grape are named different things but they're exactly the same. And so they sorted it out using genetic techniques. Cannabis hasn't been legal long enough for them to have done that work back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but we can do it now. So I would love to start working on that, getting that sorted out, getting breeder protections. And then the other thing is consumer protections. Like you can't go to a dispensary and buy something. Like I buy Blue Dream, I go home and I consume it and I go, this is not Blue Dream. You can't go back to that dispensary and be like, this is not Blue Dream. I want my money back. They're going to laugh at you and be like, you don't even know. They don't even know. The cultivators don't know. So what I'm working on, I am launching a company called TrueCut that will have all of these checkpoints. If there's a cultivator that has a verified strain like Blue Dream, let's say just for shits and giggles, a dispensary purchases that cannabis, they get a TrueCut seal of approval. This has been tested. It is Blue Dream. Then the consumer knows what they're purchasing.
yeah.
And then we can start to have, and this is our hope, is that the consumer would have like a QR code or something on there where they could go and take a survey and say what their experience was, if they're treating something, what they're treating, did it work, all that stuff. So now we can start to connect a verified strain with verified consumer experiences so we can give the consumers not only trust in what they're purchasing, but also give them a little bit more information on what strains are good for what conditions. And of course, everybody's different, just like we talked about before with medications. But it would give them a lot better idea about what direction they should go in, even if it, at the end of the day, it doesn't work for them. But at least it's a better starting point than I've got this condition. What should I buy? Where should I start? Oh, I don't know. Just try something. That's kind of where I want the whole circle covered, from breeders,
Yeah,
cultivators, dispensaries, patients. So everybody, I just want everybody to get on the same page. So that's what I'm passionate about.
that's really cool. I will note that last part you talked about the consumers and the database and everything. That's exactly the type of real world evidence that I think can be used, can be tapped to establish efficacy or effectiveness of cannabis and psychedelics, that can either supplement or replace randomized control trials.
That would be awesome. So we're about at the end of our time. Ruth, just tell people, where they can find you. You've got a couple of different resources for people to utilize if they're looking for sort of directions, right? Your website.
The easiest place to find me is on LinkedIn.
Hmm.
But I also have my quantitative assessment and analysis, quanta.com. And I wrote a book, so I have medicalcannabisprimer.com.
Hmm.
And I have blogs there, and I have lots of blogs and information on my Quanta website. And again, as I said, on LinkedIn, that's the best place to get me.
And that medical primer that you wrote is for, like, what does it contain and how can people use it? And is it a purchasable book?
Yes,
Down,
it's on, can't really see it.
yeah,
Here.
get close. There you go.
It's on the Medical Cannabis Primer or just Medical Cannabis Primer website, or you can also find it on Amazon. And there's
Okay.
a lot of information on the website.
And what's in there? Like, what would people use it
What that is, so as I said, I came to cannabis, and the idea there was I started reading everything and things started making sense. And I started giving, feeding tidbits to my brother saying, well, try this. He was getting benefits from it. And so he said to me at some point, he's an engineer. He said, we really need to create an app to help other people navigate this experience of trying to find the right products for them, to journal and to track their usage and effects. And so we decided to create this app. And in order to do that, this kind of goes back to your comment about connected understandings of things,
for?
is I naturally want to have a connected understanding. So I started reading about cannabis, and I see the word, hemp, and I see cannabis. I'm like, what is hemp? I have no idea what that is. And so
Nobody does.
I kept seeing these terms, and I needed to fill it in so I understood everything collectively, how it all fits together. And likewise, what we wanted to do is to create this app so that you go out there, and this is around 2018 or so that you have an app on your phone and you can go and you can scan in the QR code and pull up the COA information. And pull that into the app, and then get feedback from the user, like, okay, well, how are you feeling now? Okay, what did you take? How much did you take? Okay, now how are you feeling? And help them kind of organize this. And then maybe they're taking a couple of different products and understand what's doing what and what's working, and say, well, now try this, now try this. So in order to do that, what I did is I created these algorithms trying to understand all the strain information. What information do we need to collect there? What information do we need to collect from the research about what works for what? What information do we need to collect on the person? What's your situation? What are you using cannabis to deal with? And how do we integrate and track that over time? So in order to do all that, as I said, I needed a connected understanding of cannabis and kind of how it works. And I put all this information together, created the algorithms. My brother created the user interfaces and the GUIs and everything. We created a working prototype and then realized that we didn't have access to COAs. There's no barcodes on the products, and the COAs are inaccurate and blah, blah, blah. So what we did just wouldn't work, and we kind of hit a brick wall. But in the meantime, my brother said, you have so much amazing information you've put together in such an amazing way. We need to release a book. So what I said is, okay, suppose that you have experience being a researcher, and suppose you wanted to understand cannabis, basically kind of basics on how it works, and you wanted a connected understanding of how all the pieces fit together, what information would you want? And so
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of how the book was written. And it's designed to be user friendly, but things kept coming along. Like there's things I kept having to look up, like, how much flour is in a joint and how many drops in a tincture or whatever. And I'm like, well, if I keep looking this up, then other people want it too. And so kind of what are the most common cannabinoids? What are the most common terpenes? What's the difference between smoking, inhaling, tinctures, and edibles? And so there's a lot of different charts and graphs and tables, a lot of pictures. My brother's a photographer. He's an amazing photographer. So there's a lot of pictures, and we're showing it at some point to like a doctor, and it shows all the different products. And the doctor said, most doctors have never seen a cannabis product.
Mm-hmm.
So to have kind of all of them laid out now, the book was published in 2019. All of the information is still relevant. There's just a lot more information now. Everything's still accurate. The only thing that's out of date is the pictures of vape devices. Those have evolved over
Evolved.
time. But all the other information is there and talking about, cultivation and growing. And it starts off at the very beginning. Okay, tell me, why was cannabis illegal? Is it safe and is it effective? Kind of start right in with credibility. And it's trying to provide a neutral analysis. Whenever I go to something, I want to know the truth. I don't want to know propaganda from this side or that side. I want to know what the truth is. So I'm trying to present, you also need to know this kind of stuff. I don't create any new information. I collate information from other sources. So everything that I do is footnoted where here's the source that I used. And if you don't agree with it, take it up with the source. I tried to vet the information and say, okay, I think this is the most accurate stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
pulled together a lot of stuff from other people, noted it. And again, so that's what the book is about.
That sounds like an awesome book, and I kind of want to buy it now, and I think I might. It looks really digestible. I don't, I love pictures. I don't like reading text. That's part of the reason why, podcast, I don't want to read big, long LinkedIn passages. But we've come to the end of our time, and so LinkedIn is the best place to find you. You've
Yep.
got an incredible book, an incredible story, and I look forward to more interactions with you always on LinkedIn. Thanks again for your time. I super appreciate talking to you. Yeah,
Likewise, it's been so wonderful to get to know you and to talk with you. I look forward to future communication.
thank you so much, Ruth. An honor and a pleasure.
Likewise.
Thank you. Bye.